Howdy! This is part 2 of a cowboy story titled The Honest Confession of Elias Callahan. Part 1 was released last week on this channel. If you haven't listened to that, you want to listen to that first and then come back to this video. Also, if you would like a synopsis of the story, you'll find that in the description. Enjoy the story. Part 2 of The Honest Confession of Elias Callahan, a short story by Janet Keller Richards, copyright 2024, all rights reserved. In Part 1, we learn that Elias Callahan, a.k.a. Thomas Barton, wants to leave his brother's stagecoach robbing gang and turn honest. We join him in Part 2 just after he has met the town reverend who has introduced him to the town marshal. Marshal Stapleton's blue eyes are strong and clear, and at the moment they're wandering all over my entire head. I'm beginning to feel like a rooster cornered by a coyote. What if he's heard of the Callahan gang and knows that the two brothers in the gang both have red hair? I pull my cowboy hat forward to try and hide my features. "I'm mighty pleased to meet you, Mr. Barton," the marshal says as he holds out his hand. I keep my eyes lowered and shake his firm grip. "The Reverend tells me you're quite a sharpshooter. I understand you shot a revolver out of the hand of one of the robbers from about 25 feet away." My jaw is tensing up. I force myself to answer him. "Yes, sir, I suppose I did." "It was impressive," the Reverend interjects. "He also said you placed a shot right off the hoof of the second robber's horse." "Within an inch," adds Reverend Hewitt. "Is that so? Within an inch?" I nod and try not to say more than I have to. "I reckon it's so." "Where did you learn to shoot so well?" With all their questions, I'm starting to think they do recognize me. I can feel my face flushing and my forehead beading up with sweat. I give them a bit of truth and hope it'll satisfy them. My brother and I used to do target practice while growing up on Ma and Pa's homestead. I suppose I wanted to be a better shot than my brother, and that made me practice refining my aim. Both men laugh, and Marshal Stapleton says, "Well, are you?" "Am I what, sir?" "A better shot than your brother." I force a smile. "Yes, sir, I suppose I am, though he's not bad." The Reverend addresses the marshal. "John, this young gentleman is looking for work, which is the reason he's heading west." The marshal pinches his eyebrows together thoughtfully. "Is that so?" I groan inwardly. "Yes, I reckon it is." "Well, I'm heading home for breakfast now, but why don't we meet later and talk about that?" I'm not understanding. "Sir, about what?" "You're looking for work, aren't you?" "I am, though I hadn't yet thought about settling down." "Well, I just might have a job for you right here in town." He pulls out his pocket watch. "Shall I meet you at 10 o'clock at the barber shop?" I search the marshal's face for any trace of suspicion that would indicate he knows something about me, but the look in his eyes shows no sign of trickery. With one more glance at both men, I hear myself saying, "I can meet you there." "Good. It was mighty fine to meet you, Mr. Barton." Marshal Stapleton tips his hat and walks on. As we head toward his home, the Reverend says eagerly, "Well, that was good timing." I nod politely. If it weren't so downright alarming, the idea of a lawman having a job for me would be amusing. We arrive at the Reverend's house on the edge of town. He opens his front door and says, "Come in," and then turns to the woman in the kitchen. "Juliet, I've brought a guest for breakfast." She wipes her hands on a cloth and smiles at me. An aroma of cooked bacon floats my way, and my mouth starts to water. "My dear," says the Reverend, "do you remember this gentleman?" Her eyes explore my face, and her mouth drops open, and she says enthusiastically, "You're the man who saved our lives." The Reverend nods hard in agreement and doesn't give me the opportunity to deny her inflated praise. "Yes, dear, this is Thomas Barton, the man who rescued us from those robbers." He turns to me and says, "Mr. Barton, meet my wife, Juliet." I remember my manners and remove my hat. "A pleasure, ma'am." At that moment, out of a second room walks the little girl with brown eyes and brown curls, the one who waved at me from the stagecoach window. She moves over to her pa and takes his hand, all the while watching me in wide-eyed wonder. Her pa looks down at her. "Sarah, this is Mr. Barton." She answers shyly, "He's the man who helped us." Reverend Hewitt smiles widely. "Mr. Barton, this is my daughter, Sarah." "Pleased to meet you, Sarah," I say awkwardly. Mrs. Hewitt says, "We're so happy to have you in our home, Mr. Barton. You came at just the right moment, so please have a seat at the table and I'll serve the food." The Reverend hangs up my hat and takes a seat at the end of the table. He invites me to sit down, so I join him and glance around. The home is simple and inviting, like my parents' home was during my growing up years. It's been 7 years since Ma and Pa died, and equally as long since I've been able to call any place home. I feel the tug of desire for a place to settle and stay for a longer spell. If only I didn't have to hide a dishonest past. Mrs. Hewitt places the bowls of hot food on the table. She sits down and Sarah sits beside her. The Reverend bows his head to pray, and his family does the same. I bow my head too. Lord, thank you for our guest, Mr. Barton. Thank you for this opportunity to welcome him into our home. Thank you for using him to rescue us from those robbers. Bless him and show him the right pathway for his life. And we ask you to bless this food and bless the hands that prepared it so lovingly for us. In the name of Jesus, amen. Except for several rare occasions when Pa prayed over us boys, I've never had anyone pray aloud for me. That the Reverend would ask the good Lord to bless me when I am the last person God would want to bless is embarrassing. I keep my eyes on the table. Reverend Hewitt picks up the heaping bowl of bacon and hands it to me. "Take as much as you like, Mr. Barton. There's plenty to go around." The food bowls are passed, and I load more onto my plate than I probably should because I am so incredibly hungry. I put a piece of bacon in my mouth. Its salty flavor brings to my mind happier days when my family ate around a table. Before the meal's over, I have eaten 5 slices of bacon, 4 eggs, 2 helpings of potato slices, and 2 pieces of buttered bread. I feel like I've died and gone to heaven. "Are you sure you won't have more, Mr. Barton?" the Reverend asks. "Thank you, Reverend, but I am quite satisfied. Mrs. Hewitt, it was delicious." She smiles shyly. "Thank you." The Reverend leans back and smiles. "It does our hearts good to have you at our table. After such a courageous act of bravery on your part, it's the very least we can do for you." His praise feels undeserved because I know who I am. Like a windstorm extinguishing a candle flame, the dozens of robberies I've committed have more than extinguished my one act of kindness. I answer honestly, "Reverend Hewitt, I am grateful for your kind words, but I am not so good as you think." The Reverend's eyes sparkle as the laugh lines around them crinkle. "Mr. Barton, when Marshal Stapleton and I were discussing the events of the robbery, he mentioned he's been thinking about hiring a deputy, what with all the growth the town's been experiencing and the influx of panhandlers and trappers. At the time, I remarked to him it was too bad we couldn't hire the young sharpshooter who thwarted the stagecoach robbery. And now here you are. I believe it's none other than the providence of God that has set in place all these circumstances. You were walking out the door just as I was walking by the hotel. Why, we almost ran into each other. Then we encountered the marshal on the sidewalk as we were coming to breakfast. Now he's interested in talking to you about that deputy position. I'm certain of it." I shift my gaze down to the floorboards beneath my feet. For a good while I don't say anything because I don't know what to say. In the silence, it dawns on me as clear as a Montana sunrise that if I don't tell the truth, I'll spend the rest of my life fearing discovery. And that seems no different than spending the last 6 years in hideouts and caves for fear of being found out. If I tell all, I'm positive I risk going to jail. I probably won't hang because we never killed anyone. We never shot anyone. We never even beat anybody up. We only robbed people. But to the law, robbery is worthy of jail time. I look up at the reverend. I can feel my jaw muscles working back and forth with worry. I quietly say again, I am not so good as you think I am. He nods slowly, his eyes studying my face. He's reading me the way someone reads a book, examining me to understand. After a while, he says simply, none of us is as good as we think we are. That's where grace comes in, Mr. Barton. It fills the holes where we've been devilish, and it gives us what we need to change our ways. You don't understand, Reverend. I realize I am about to lay out the very words that will convict me, words that could send me behind bars. But I told Abe and the boys I want to go honest, and here is my chance. I say quietly, so as not to frighten the Reverend's little girl or his wife who are cleaning the dishes in the kitchen. The truth is, I have done the very things those robbers did. I have robbed and stolen. I glance guiltily at the kitchen, but his wife and daughter keep working as if they haven't heard me. The Reverend is reading me again. With those studying eyes, he asks sincerely, "Are you finished robbing?" I am surprised by his question. Yes, I say fervently. I am sick of it. I left my brother and his gang east of Helena in Montana Territory, and I came west because I want to start a new life. The Reverend nods thoughtfully. I decide to be even more forthcoming. I never understood what it must be like to be on the other end of guns being waved during a robbery. But when I saw your little girl come out of the stagecoach, and then your wife pushed her behind her own body in protection, I could feel the fear of every person I've ever robbed. Hot tears press against the inside of my eyes, and I add almost in a whisper, I am ashamed, Reverend. I look down and keep my eyes trained on the table in front of me. There is only silence. After a good 15 seconds, he asks intently, "Did you ever harm or kill a person?" "No, I swear I didn't. We never hurt or murdered anybody, and that's the God-honest truth." The Reverend leans in toward me and lowers his voice. "Marshal Stapleton wasn't so different than you. When he was a teenager, he went in with the wrong kind of people, and for a few years he was a dishonest, deceptive, and rebellious troublemaker. I'll let him tell you more if he wants to. But, Mr. Barton, I believe you when you say you're finished with that life." I reckon if I'm going to be honest with the Reverend, I may as well tell him the rest. My name isn't Barton. My real name is Elias Callahan. I glance over at him. As far as I can tell, there's no spark of recognition at hearing my name. Thankfully, it appears our notoriety didn't travel this far. He's quiet for a bit before saying, "Callahan, that's Irish. That explains your red hair." I nod. "Yes, sir, my pa was from Ireland." Reverend Hewitt stands up and puts a hand on my shoulder. "Well, Mr. Callahan, let's go talk to Marshal Stapleton, shall we?" The relief of owning what I've done is bittersweet. I'm afraid of what's coming, but even if jail awaits, I know I'm doing the right thing. A weight has lifted off my chest, one I wasn't even aware I'd been carrying. "Mrs. Hewitt, thank you for such a delicious breakfast," I say as I stand. I don't know whether the Reverend's wife has heard any of my confessions, but if she has, I can't see any change in her manner with me. She turns and shakes my hand. "Mr. Barton, Callahan, it has been a great pleasure to meet you. And my husband is an excellent judge of character, so any friend of his is welcome in our home." So she did hear. I lower my eyes as the pressure of humiliation creeps up my neck and across my face. I cannot believe these fine folks aren't throwing me out onto the street. Reverend Hewitt leans down and kisses the top of his sweet little girl's head and then stands up and gestures with his hand to the front door. "Shall we?" I nod as he hands me my hat. As we step outside, the Reverend says, "You were brave back there, Mr. Callahan. It takes a man to be so candid." I keep my eyes on the boards of the sidewalk beneath my feet. I'm thinking the Reverend is much too generous with his words. Brave is not how I would describe myself. We cross the street and arrive at a newly constructed building, one of only a few two-story buildings along Main Street. The Reverend opens the front door and gestures for me to enter first. "Here we are. Let's go inside." "Gentlemen, welcome!" Marshal Stapleton stands to greet us. Once we're inside, he closes the door behind us and pulls the shade down over the window. Apparently he's closing up shop while we visit. As we sit down in a circle and face each other, I wonder why we're meeting in the barber shop. Marshal Stapleton must see the confusion on my face because he answers my silent question. "The town can't quite pay for a full-time marshal, so when I'm not doing official duties, I am the town barber." With a grin, he adds, "So I bring them to justice, and when it's appropriate, I give them a shave with a sharp, straight razor to let them know their life is in my hands." Reverend Hewitt clears his throat and smiles politely at the marshal's joke. Marshal Stapleton continues, "So tell me about yourself, Mr. Barton. Where do you come from? And if I were to offer you a part-time job as the deputy marshal in this town, would you be interested in settling here?" I am stymied by the loaded questions being fired at me. I cast a desperate look at the Reverend, who is nodding my way and smiling as if to say I should plow ahead. Images flood my mind of sitting in a jail cell for the next few years. But I've already told the Reverend the truth, so there's no turning back. I sit forward in my chair and glance at Marshal Stapleton before staring down at my feet again and spilling it all. "Sir, I'm not the man you think I am. I have robbed people, just like the robbers who tried to hold up the stagecoach. Until a week ago, I was part of my brother's gang over in Montana, but I got plumb tired of it, so I told my brother I wanted out. Thankfully, he didn't shoot me on the spot, and here I am. I came west because I want to turn honest and live an upright life." The marshal leans back and folds his arms across his chest. His eyebrows pull together like he's thinking hard. He looks over at Reverend Hewitt. "You know all of this, Reverend?" "Yes, I do, John. This young man told me everything after breakfast this morning." "And what do you think?" The marshal's question is directed at the Reverend. Reverend Hewitt cocks his head my way and starts to read me again like a book. "Well, I reckon this young man is telling the truth, but I suppose we'll need to bring him before the judge and let the judge decide his fate." The marshal raises one eyebrow, watches the face of the Reverend, and then smiles and nods. "I think you're right, Reverend Hewitt." I hang my head and heaviness returns to settle on my shoulders. I can't imagine a judge is going to give me any verdict but guilty. Everything I pictured about going to jail seems to be coming true. The marshal stands and walks to a cabinet fastened to the wall. He opens one of its doors and grabs something from inside. He hands the item to Reverend Hewitt. When the preacher takes it, I see it's a wooden judge's gavel about 8 inches long. The Reverend bangs the gavel on the small table in front of him. His face grows serious. "By the power invested in me as the presiding judge over the town of Salmon, Idaho, I call this court to order." I stare at the Reverend and wonder why he is impersonating a judge. "For the crime of robbery, I hereby find you guilty, Elias Callahan, and I sentence you to a year of community service in this town. I place you under the dual jurisdiction of this judge and of the town marshal. Our jurisdiction will determine the duties of your year of service, which begins the moment this court session is adjourned." The Reverend bangs his gavel a second time and adds, "I hereby adjourn this session of court." I gape in disbelief. By all intents and purposes, it appears the Reverend is also the town judge. The Reverend turned judge sits back and eyes the marshal. "Well, John, what do you think?" Judge Hewitt, the marshal answers. I think this young man, Elias, will make a fine deputy, and that should do well to fulfill his year of service to this town. The judge slaps me heartily on the back and smiles widely. I quite agree, Marshal Stapleton. The marshal turns to me and his brows furrow deeply. It won't pay much, mind you, but we'll see you get 3 meals a day and have clothing to wear. And there's a room above the barber shop where you can hang your hat to sleep at night. I can't believe what I'm hearing. These men are serious. I stare at one and then turn to stare at the other. They're both smiling at me and waiting for me to say something. All at once, the burdens of shame and guilt that I've carried around for 6 long years, like an invisible ball and chain, erupt from my chest and wash up over my head until I can no longer fight back the tears. Through the choking sounds constricting my throat, I say rather forcefully, "If I were you, I would put a man like me behind bars." Marshal Stapleton smiles and nods. I know what you're feeling, Elias. As a young man, I felt the same profound relief when I was forgiven of similar crimes. He looks over at the reverend and his eyes soften. But someone saw that I wanted to do what was right, and he had mercy on me. I am embarrassed at the tears coursing down my cheeks. Wiping them away with a shirt sleeve, I shake my head and then lean forward and bury my face in my hands. Somehow I feel even God isn't mad at me, and it makes me blubber even harder. It takes me a bit of time to get a hold of myself. When I finally pull my hands away from my tear-streaked face, I can see a clean handkerchief setting on my lap. I wipe my eyes and my nose. "Thank you," I say quietly. The reverend puts his hand on my shoulder. "It's called grace, Elias. Sometime I'll tell you my own story of when I was your age and almost killed a man." My eyes grow wide with surprise, and he laughs at my reaction. "And you thought you were the only one who needed reforming." Marshal Stapleton chimes in. "From now on, young man, you'll be using your talents to keep law and order." I smile and imagine myself with a badge like the one the marshal is wearing. It's a strange concept, but I like it. "Yes, sir, I'll do my best." "We may as well get started now," he says. "Part of our job as marshals is to keep the streets clean." I raise my eyebrows and look at him. "You mean free of riffraff?" He shakes his head. "That too, but I'm talking about keeping the streets of the town tidy. Every morning except on Sundays, I walk Main Street and gather up any refuse. It's the order part of keeping law and order." I nod and say honestly, "I am just so relieved to be a free man, I will willingly gather refuse all day long for the rest of the year." The reverend and the marshal laugh, and together the 3 of us head outside. Before he leaves us, Reverend Hewitt reaches up and lays a hand on my shoulder again. "I can tell you're going to fit right in here, Elias." "Thank you, Reverend," I say gratefully. He bids us good day and walks toward his home. Marshal Stapleton and I head to the edge of town and begin to pick up bits of trash off the dusty street. My brother comes to mind, and I wonder if it's too late for him. But I'm beginning to think in the good Lord's book, it's never too late for anybody who's willing. As I grab another piece of paper blowing across the street, the goodness of becoming an honest man settles down into my soul and begins to plant itself there. I start to imagine putting down roots and growing a new life in this place. And I can almost feel the seeds starting to sprout. I sure hope you enjoyed that story because I had a lot of fun writing it. If you did like it, please hit the like button, leave a comment because I like to know as the author what you thought. I'd love to hear your impressions. And also you can subscribe if you want more stuff like that on this channel. Also, I do have an allegorical novel that is really good. I've heard a lot of positive feedback from the readers, and that is called The Other Side of Visible. The links to a free excerpt that you can read are in the description below, as well as reading readers' reviews. I'll see you next week. Next week is a theme video for this story where I talk about some of the research that I did regarding cowboys and the Wild West. It's really fun and interesting. So I'll see you then. Until then, y'all have a great week.